I'm very grateful for our two speakers for being here. I am delighted to be able to introduce, I'll start with Susan here on my left. She's the program and project director of the Donaldson Adoption Institute. Notice I got it right. And a professor emerita of the School of Social Work at Illinois State University. She's been a leading researcher in the field of post-adoption services for the past 25 years, so she brings a wealth of knowledge with her. She's co-authored 3 books on adoption, as well as over 15 journal articles, several book chapters, and numerous scholarly monographs. Smith and Jean Howard, one of her colleagues who she's worked a lot with, jointly received the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Adoption 2002 Excellence Award for their work in applied scholarship and research. And she currently resides in Raleigh, North Carolina, so thanks for schlepping up here. Deborah Siegel, who is a professor at the School of Social Work, Rhode Island College, just met a colleague, right, or a friend, where she teaches clinical practice and research. She's on the executive committee of the Adoption and Foster Care Educational Collaborative, provides clinical services to people whose lives are touched by adoption, does legislative advocacy related to adoption and consultation, and training for adoption professionals and agencies. Her research focuses on the experiences of families and children living with open adoption. She has co-authored 2 books on how to help families coping with struggling teens and has published many articles and chapters on an array of clinical issues. She has also taught at Auburn University, University of Missouri-Columbia, and the University of Chicago, where she earned her graduate degrees and served as a teaching and research fellow. So please join me in welcoming Susan and Deborah. So I'm giving you, you guys want 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Back and forth?
Yeah, thanks. Hello, intrepid travelers through the long 2 days of conferences. You all get a gold star or an M&M for sticking it out until the bitter end on Friday afternoon. Okay, this is Susan's laptop. What do I hit to change the slide?
Just down.
Just down. Ah, it worked. Okay. Okay, so in a nutshell, the purpose of this session is to introduce a training package that we created for the Donaldson Adoption Institute. It hasn't been formally released yet. Its intention is to be used by adoption agencies nationwide to help prepare expectant biological parents and expectant adoptive parents for open adoption relationships. So it's to be used in the front end of the open adoption journey for both the biological family and the adoptive family. And the idea is for this training package to be coupled with some audio-visual tools and then distributed later on, and we're just introducing it today. So we just wanted to have a sense before we take the plunge into showing you what the curriculum is. We wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you are adoption professionals? Okay, so we're talking to the right audience. And it means that what we'll do is quickly move through some of the slides that will contain material that you already know. We'll just show them up here so you get a sense of the information that is included in this training package, information that would be highly relevant to biological parents and adoptive parents who are thinking about entering an open adoption relationship. Okay, so in my research on open adoption, about 24 years ago when I first started interviewing adoptive parents who had just adopted an infant in an open adoption, one of my research respondents said to me, an adoptive mother, she said, living with open adoption is like climbing a mountain blindfolded without a roadmap. What she said was supported this morning by the birth mother who sat up here and talked about how she kind of, oh, there you are. I'm talking about you. By what you said this morning about your own entry into the open adoption adventure, sort of not getting a whole lot of guidance or instruction from the people that you thought were professionals who were there to guide you and advise you. You sort of figured it out on your own as you went along. Is that a fair characterization? Yeah, right. So that's what this curriculum is for. And the quote up here is from an adoptive parent who felt very much the way you felt. at the front end. And the ultimate goal of this training package is to empower expectant biological parents who are thinking about becoming birth parents, and to empower prospective adoptive parents with the knowledge and skills that they need to have a successful open adoption journey ahead. The curriculum starts out by trying to define what open adoption is, and obviously that can be a somewhat controversial thing since people will define open adoption differently. And then the curriculum moves to explaining what the purposes of openness in adoption are, and exploring how secrecy and disconnection can be damaging for children as well as for biological families and adoptive families. And then the curriculum gets really interesting, I think, in exploring some of the predictable, normal tensions that can arise in open adoption relationships. And then the curriculum concludes with specific strategies and guidelines to help families navigate their way through some of the more choppy water that might lie ahead. The curriculum begins with asking the participants to create a shared promise. I love these ducks that I found on the internet to stick in here. I don't know what I Googled in order to come up with them, but I thought it kind of summed it up. Because you've probably found in your own clinical work in adoption that adoption conversations can elicit primal emotion, people disagreeing profoundly about all kinds of stuff. So the curriculum begins with a request that the people in the training agree that it's important to disagree, and that it's important to disagree agreeably. And Module 2 is yours.
I wanted to add that much of the content that the curriculum is built on was published by the Institute last year in a paper that's on our website that you can download for free on openness and adoption that Deborah and I wrote together. And basically, this is built on both a synthesis of the research literature about open adoption, as well as the Institute did a survey of 100 infant adoption programs that the results are reported in this paper, and I'll speak to a few of them in the presentation. But if you want, there's a detailed reference list on here of various kinds of research on openness. We decided to just there are 6 modules in this curriculum, and the curriculum, which we're hoping is finished by the fall, will include the PowerPoint, a trainer's guide, and a video that we're still in the process of making, which is why this wasn't released months ago. But we decided in the presentation to just walk through the same 6 modules that we do in the training. These are just about half the slides, but you get the gist of what we included in the curriculum. These are Module 2, the general topics, and we really start off with helping parents understand the purpose of openness is for the child. The overriding goal of openness is to facilitate the adjustment of the adopted child, and we really start with helping them try to empathize with what it's like to be an adopted child. So we start off obviously defining open adoption, and this is a Dear Abby letter that was published a couple of years ago that I love, because it's obvious that this adoptive mother totally embraces openness and the child's right to know both birth and adoptive family. And I asked myself, what percentage, if you ask the general population, what percentage of adults could agree with this perspective? And I think it's just a very healthy place to start from in helping parents think that this is the child's right to their own information. This is just thinking about how different adoption is now than it was just 50 years ago. I started practicing in infant adoption in 1969. at that time, I started off working in Tennessee and Illinois. Abortion was not legal in either state. Birth fathers had no rights. It just was a vastly different realm than what it is today. And, you know, that's part of a lifetime. Originally, in the mid-50s, adoption was designed to deny differences of adoption. We matched kids. Still, when I started working, they were still matching kids by appearance. The chosen child presentation was very common. They minimized any negative struggles related to adoption, and youth that wanted to search for birth family were viewed as maladjusted or not content in their adoptive family. So we've come a long way just in terms of our understanding of adoption and helping families see the difference now. Is somebody raising their hand in the back? Oh, no. Okay. This is from a study that we did at the Adoption Institute, underscoring that adoption is an important aspect of identity for adopted adults. We did a study of adopted adults, and the blue line is Korean adopted adults, and the red line is Caucasian adopted adults, and we had close to 400 respondents, and we asked them to rate the importance of adoption in their identity at different stages of their life. And of course, this is retrospective, and we aren't sure that at elementary age it would have been the same. But basically, it shows that their interest in adoption and their identity as an adopted person goes up from preschool years up to late adulthood. And, you know, there were not as many that had reached that late age. We had maybe 10 that had reached 60 and older. But one of the things that you sort of expect is that it peaks in adolescence and then it kind of goes down. But that's not the case. Their interest in adoption continues growing up into young adulthood, and it stays high for the rest of their life. So we just use this as a jumping off point to help parents recognize that adoption is generally an issue with people who are adopted. Adopted individuals as children, as they grow up, have many questions that they seek answers to, and this is why Adam mentioned this morning that David Brzezinski says when they ask how many adopted people search, he says all of them do. Because as children, you are searching for answers when you're wondering, why did my birth mother decide to place me for adoption? Or who do I look like? And that, in his view, is psychological searching. So we have zillions of questions as adopted people that, and I'm not adopted, but I've known many adopted people who look throughout their lives, they have different questions that emerge at different ages. Adoptive parents have the task of supporting their children and integrating adoption in their identity, and they can do this effectively or in many ways thwart it. And we try to help adoptive parents think about what is their role in relation to their child's coming to a comfort level with adoption. And these are all tasks for adoptive parents. Gathering information about the child's history, helping them feel comfortable asking for answers to their questions. And we lead into helping them understand that there is communicative openness and structural openness. No matter what the structural openness level, from closed confidential adoptions to very open, adoptive families achieve some level of communicative openness. It's kind of hard to say. And we talk about what that is, that children, if you can empathize with your child's feelings related to adoption, encourage them to be open and asking questions, have permission to find answers and know that you will support them in finding the answers, then you would have a high level of communicative openness. I remember one adopted child I talked with said that whenever she asked about adoption, her adoptive mother kind of got teary-eyed and got very quiet. And she had the message from early on, this is not something she wants to talk about. So, I mean, all of these responses, non-verbally as well as verbally, convey a certain attitude about communicating about adoption. There's a lot of research that shows that communicative openness is the most important aspect of predicting a positive adjustment to adoption. This is a study, there's a couple of others that we have in the curriculum, but this is one that David Brzezinski did with children in middle childhood, and he developed a questionnaire with questions like, my parents are comfortable with me asking questions about being adopted. I don't know, he developed about 10 different questions that relate to communicative openness. And he found that children who rate their parents high in communicative openness have more positive self-esteem and fewer behavior problems than those that rated low in communicative openness. And he said even though those who had structurally open adoptions were more likely to rate higher on open communication, that communicative openness was related to adjustment, whereas structural openness was not. So there have been other studies with adopted teens that found positive outcomes with high levels of communicative openness. So we stress the importance of that with adoptive parents. This is the continuum of structural openness, which all of us know goes from closed or confidential with mediated in the middle and open adoptions on the far end. Fully disclosed adoptions can involve ongoing contact, and they may not involve plans for ongoing contact. In Ruth and Howe's research, they use the term fully disclosed for they have exchanged identifying information and they know who each other is. This is our definition of open adoption in the curriculum, that identifying information has been exchanged and there is some plan for ongoing contact that involves the child. We would not classify something as fully open where the adoptive parent and the birth parent had contact but the child didn't know it was going on, which some people would label as open. In our study that the Institute did, we surveyed 208 infant adoption programs in 26 states, and we had a pretty good response rate. And we asked them how many adoptions they'd done in the past 2 years and what % would fall along this continuum. And we found that 95% of the programs offered open adoption, and this is how they broke down the number of the adoptions they'd done on this scale of openness. Roughly, if you look at the other fairly recent studies like the Early Child Growth and Development Study and the National Survey of Adoptive Parents and so forth, roughly from a half to 2/3 would fall in the significantly open end of the continuum. There were only 5% of these adoptions that were confidential. And one of the things that is interesting, like in Ruth and Howe's research, many of the mediated adoptions became open within the first 2 or 3 years of the adoption. Actually, I think 2/3 of the mediated adoptions became open. So, you know, this is what it was at the outset. It's not necessarily the level of openness that will be there throughout. It's all the research that you see says one size does not fit all. There's no one type of open adoption. Every family has a different arrangement, different kinds of contact, frequency, etc. Deb is going to talk about Module 3. Okay.
What Susan has been talking about is the slides that are in the training package that are designed to begin to orient expectant first parents and expectant adoptive parents for what open adoption is and what open adoption can look like. The whole idea of the curriculum is to begin the process of addressing people's anxieties and fears and hopes and worries about entering open adoption, and to equip them with some knowledge about how open adoption came about and why the vast majority of adoptions today include some kind of openness. And as part of that process of educating people about why, I guess the next slide is a clip from that, I think it's available on YouTube, from a film called Unlocking the Heart of Adoption. I don't know if you want to look at it. We may not be hooked up to the internet. Anyway, you can write down in your notes Unlocking the Heart of Adoption and just look at it on YouTube. It's just a few minutes long, and it's a birth mother talking about the anguish of the adoption process back in the days of closed adoption. And then it's a young man of color who was adopted by a white family talking about how profoundly disturbing it was to be obviously different from his family and yet treated as if there was no difference, both in terms of transracial, transcultural issues and not being biologically connected with his family. It's a very moving clip. And his adoptive parents then come on and they talk about the anguish for them in the whole issue of denial of difference. And so showing biological parents and prospective adoptive parents this clip can be the beginning of helping them open up their minds and their hearts to the whole idea of why some kind of openness is in the best interests of not only the child but of themselves. And by the way, as I'm talking, if you want to react with thoughts or comments or you have questions, feel free. You don't have to wait till I'm finished. I'm used to being interrupted. And then we included in the PowerPoint some experiential exercises to begin to help biological parents and adoptive parents sensitize themselves to what it might feel like to be a child who doesn't know. And so there are a couple of these imagine exercises included in the training package. So this one introduces a child who is sitting in school, staring out the window and just wondering, you know, where did I come from? Was I plopped on the planet like Superman? Who do I look like? Am I going to bump into my birth father in the supermarket someday? Am I going to end up dating a cousin or a sibling that I don't know is a cousin or a sibling? All the things that children in closed adoptions might wonder about. And then there are similar slides in the packet designed to help prospective adoptive parents imagine what it's like to be a first parent, a birth parent, and similar slides designed for first parents to help them begin to feel what it's like to be in the shoes of an adoptive parent. And the details of these slides are spelled out in the curriculum. And then there are brainstorming exercises in the training package to help the participants in the training get a firmer handle on exactly how secrecy and cutoffs hurt people. And then the package moves into some of the research on the impacts of secrecy and cutoffs. And the research is organized into how secrets create psychological issues, the medical consequences of secrecy, and then the interpersonal consequences of secrecy, with a focus on how carrying, well, this morning's panel certainly illuminated how secrets within the birth family are painful for birth family members, and how secrets in the adoptive family are painful for adoptive family members. So secrecy not only hurts the adopted person, it hurts everybody in the extended family of adoption. So there's quite a bit of detail in the package on this issue of how secrets affect all members of the extended family of adoption. This slide details some of the ways that secrecy impacts adoptive parents. And this one is on how secrets affect birth parents. So you can see that the training package is designed not only to educate, but to touch the participants emotionally. Because, as you know from your own work, when we take people at the front end of the adoption journey and we provide them with psychoeducation, we may be trying to educate people who are in a place in their own process where they're not all that ready for the information that we have to provide. So our best bet is to try to create a training curriculum that touches not only people's minds, but also their hearts. And the best way to touch their hearts is to touch them. That would be one of the first steps in opening up people who are afraid to being able to begin to empathize with other participants in the adoption adventure. And now Susan's going to do module 4. At least it keeps us forth.
Yeah, keep you away. The video that we are currently producing, Jean Howard, who also works with the Institute, her husband is a documentary photographer, and the two of them are doing the video that goes with the curriculum. And it includes not only families, different pieces of families who have open adoption relationships, but also like it starts with a young woman who grew up in a closed adoption, talking about what it was like for her as a child without being able to find answers to her questions. And she searched as a mid-teen with the support of her adoptive family and found her birth family and had a reunion, and it talked about the benefits of that for her. And we're trying to make it balanced. You know, you struggle in all of this to not come across like you're trying to push open adoption. The studies show that families that felt coerced into choosing openness were much less likely to have positive relationships. So honesty and self-determination in the process is really important. One of the things we know is that the general public has very little understanding of openness or the benefits of openness. And one of the interesting things I found, the Institute's adoption attitude study they did in the 90s, it was published in 97, they asked the public, it was a nationally representative sample, how many of them would support birth mothers occasionally sending cards and letters to the adoptive family in most adoptions, and only 16% of the general public supported that in the 90s. Openness is something that, you know, we've come a long way in a fairly short time, but it's just not very well understood to people that don't have experience with it. So one of the things we learned from our survey of infant adoption programs, we asked the social workers what did they do to prepare parents and what were the barriers that they ran across, what were the ways in which strategies they used to overcome the barriers. And many of them said everybody is afraid of everybody starting out. Birth parents are afraid of adoptive parents are afraid of birth parents. And the thing that made the most difference in overcoming that was to hear they would talk about having trainings where there would be a panel of birth parents who would talk about their situation, or a panel of birth and adoptive parents who had open adoption relationships talking about their relationships. And that's what we're trying to do with the video generally, is to include those experiences and expand their getting in touch with other people. So you all know the many myths about open adoption, that children will be confused, that birth parents it'll keep the grief alive forever, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, all of these myths have been refuted by the body of research that exists. These are the general conclusions of the body of research on openness that's discussed. Whoops, I hit something wrong. all of the studies that have been done, the vast majority of adopted parents are supportive of continuing the open adoption relationship. Even if there have been challenges along the way, they see it as more advantageous than not. And they, in various studies, like I remember Ruth's last second wave, 94% of the adoptive mothers in open adoption relationships with contact were satisfied and comfortable with the relationship. 94% is a pretty high percent. You wouldn't find that many married people comfortable in their marriage. So, I think, if you look at over the years, the body of research, there are a few. Deb Siegel just published a study. Deborah, I know you don't like. Okay. She doesn't like Deb. Deborah just published an article in Social Work Journal on adoptive parents' attitudes, and their kids are now in their 20s. And basically, all of them, with the exception of one parent, was very comfortable and satisfied with the relationship. So generally, if you look at the body of research, there are not that many dramatic difficulties, showing up. It is important for them to be able to guide the adoptive parents. The children's behavioral adjustment is not related to the level of structural openness. There's no study, maybe with the exception of one qualifier, that has found that children in open adoptions have fewer behavior problems than children in closed adoptions. But there are studies that show like the level of satisfaction with openness and the cooperation in the open adoption relationship is related to the children's adjustment. There's no detrimental effects of open adoption. They change over time. And one study, I tried to look at, there are two studies that have evidence about what percent of adoptions that are planned to be open actually cease contact over the course of the longitudinal study. And I found that about 20% in two studies of planned open adoptions did not continue their contact over a period of many years. So most of these continued. And as Ruth's study found, some of the open adoptions were not planned as open adoptions. They evolved into more openness. The benefits of openness for adopted individuals is the central reason why we have open adoption. And this is one of my favorite studies that I ran across in helping parents understand the benefits of openness to children. It's by, the first author is Berge, B-E-R-G-E. It's from Ruth and Hal's Minnesota, Texas Adoption Research Project. And they interviewed 152, I think it was, teenagers at varying levels of openness about their satisfaction with their level of openness. And there were 77 teens who had contact with birth parents. And they asked them what they liked, what they got out of the contact. And these are the things that they underscored: that there were physical touchstones to identify where traits came from. This teen said, it's hard when everybody looks a lot alike and I don't look like any of them. And they say so-and-so looks like so-and-so, and it's really hard. When I see pictures of my birth mother or visit, I see the similarities and can say, I look more like her. So this was one thing that was mentioned a lot. And when you ask, I know my colleague Jean Howard did her dissertation with adult adopted women, and the most important thing to them in wanting to search was finding out what people in their birth family looked like. That sense of resembling someone was really important to many of them. And I think the physical touchstones, knowing, like, if you weren't adopted and you grew up in a birth family, how tall people are, if they wore glasses, you know, a lot of things. You have some sense of estimating what you might look like, but when you have no touchstone for that, it's much harder. Coming to terms with the reason for your adoption was another major benefit of having a relationship. This was a young girl who said in 5th grade, this one girl was saying, "I feel so sorry for you because your parents gave you up." And I'm like, you know, it's not like that. I've met my birth mother and I know the whole story, and she loves me, and she still does. If I hadn't met Karen, I wouldn't have been able to answer that question. So I think this is a major benefit of having contact with birth relatives. Information that aided in their identity formation. I love this quote. This is a young man who said, "I think I am who I am because not just of the family who raised me, but because of the 2 people that made me. I think it's a combination of all of that, and being able to know all of them has really helped me to just be who I am." And, you know, that's such a validating statement and ability to feel. Positive feelings toward the birth mother was another major benefit, and many of them describe their birth mother as an additional supportive adult relationship in their life. And this was a male teen who said, "She's mainly a friend, I guess. I mean, it's like I have the parent because I already have that, but she's mainly just another person who loves me." Birth parents have many benefits from openness. This is a quote I love that Patricia Dorner said, that birth parents need to know that whatever they do, they'll always be important to the child they created. They can be a ghost figure or a personal resource, and they need help in deciding which one they want to be. And I think that's very powerful for birth parents to help them recognize that they can contribute to their child's life as a resource. The research on benefits of openness to birth parents shows higher satisfaction with the adoption process, that they have better grief resolution at a higher level of openness. This is from Ruth and Hal's study about grief resolution 8 years after adoption, and this is the percent that were rated as good to very good grief resolution at different levels of openness. And as you can see, those at fully disclosed level had much higher percent rated as good or very good grief resolution. Adoptive parents report many benefits of openness. They actually report that they have less fear of the birth parent and a greater sense of entitlement. Like Susan was saying earlier, it's very validating to adoptive parents to see that the child claims them as their psychological parent, that it's not, when they grow up in an open adoption relationship, it's not the sense of competition as there is with these teenagers who get discovered all of a sudden at age 14 or 18 or being threatened. They have greater empathy both for their child in relation to adoption and to birth parents. And more positive, one of my favorite studies is a study about adoptive fathers' perception of their child's biological father, and those that have met the biological father have a much more positive perception of them as a person than those who had not met them. And those who participated, if the biological father participated in the adoption, they had a more positive attitude. If all they know about the biological father is what they heard from the birth mother, then they were more likely to have a negative perception of the biological father. So that has to get passed on to their child at some level. Okay, these aspects we have, Deb's going to talk about the guidelines for successful open adoptions, and these were developed from many of the things we got on the surveys that workers said were important in developing open adoptions.
thus far in the training package, obviously, everything has been about what is open adoption, why secrets don't work, and what the benefits of open adoption are. The next section of the curriculum is the how-to. How do you make an open adoption work? And I want to say that the training package is put together in such a way that agencies can harvest bits of the package or use the whole thing, depending on what the agency's preferences and needs are with the clientele that they're serving. So I think this section on the how-to might be useful not only on the front end in the planning phase, but if agencies are engaged in ongoing support with families living in open adoptions, this how-to section may be useful as well. But it's kind of a mix and match cafeteria style training package. Okay, so the guidelines. We clustered the guidelines into these 4 major areas. The benefits, the guidelines for effective open adoption are clustered under the heading of education, understanding open adoption. The second is values and relationship qualities. The third is emphasizing voice and choice, both for the child, the biological family, and the adoptive family. And then the third heading is guidelines regarding how to communicate collaboratively. Okay, so under the heading of self-educating, guidelines for success include all the adults understanding that open adoption is for the child. Even though there are all kinds of benefits for the adoptive parents and for the birth parents, it's for the child. And that this requires self-knowledge on all of the parents' parts, because those of you who are parents know how easy it is for us to confuse what's good for us with what's good for our kids, right? Like if it's good for me, for the kids to be asleep by 9 o'clock, I think it's good for the kids to be asleep at 9 o'clock, but that's not necessarily always the case. Okay. One of the guidelines for success in open adoption would be for the parents to understand the importance of self-educating throughout the process, not just on the front end. And for the parents, both the biological and adoptive parents, to have contact with other people living a similar journey to theirs. Then there are all these relational qualities that are important for success. The ability to put the child's needs first, the ability to be aware of one's own needs and separate them from the kids, the ability to be honest with oneself. Because if we're not honest with ourselves as parents, it's hard for us to be honest with the child's corresponding parents. Being respectful of people that we're angry at or feel alienated from is a challenge, and yet if we're committed to respectful communication, it's going to work out better. So there's a piece in the curriculum about how important it is for us to be aware of language that we use that stereotypes whole classes of people. Another value and relationship quality would be being able to look at the other with compassion and without judgment, even when they're engaging in behaviors that make it hard for us to feel empathic. Being flexible to change things as people's needs change is a value orientation and relationship quality. And having a commitment to making the open adoption work is a very important relational quality in open adoption. And in my research with adoptive families over a 25-year period now, starting with when the children of adoption were infants and now they're young adults, it's clear to me that one of the things that's made the relationships work is that I haven't studied the birth parents, I've only examined the adoptive parents and the young adult adoptees. What's made it work in part is no matter what untoward events have occurred in the open adoption relationships, for some reason the adoptive parents in my study just believe in it. They are committed to it. They understand that it's better for their children and they're willing to hang in there when there are bumps in the road. So for example, one family had the experience where the birth mom said, "Come to the airport, I'm flying in to visit you, I'll be on the 8:30 U.S. Air flight landing in Minneapolis at 7 p.m. And the family goes to the airport and they're standing at the gate and nobody gets off the plane. And then the birth mother, they call the birth mother and she goes, yeah, I missed that plane, but I couldn't get to a phone, but I'm coming in on the 10:30 flight. So the family camps out in the airport for 3.5 hours and they wait for the birth mother to come in on the 10:30 flight, and she doesn't show up, and they call her and she has another reason. And they do this all night long until they realize this isn't working. So it was a very disturbing event to the adoptive family and to the adoptee, who was part of this whole thing. And yet this family was able to take some time to be angry and hurt and upset and all that, and then regroup. And the event that I just described happened when the adoptee was 12, and he's now 23, and they still have a successful open adoption. That's just an example of some of the stuff that happens that people weather because they're committed. There's a commitment to making the relationship work. And I say it's very analogous to being married, right? Being partnered, and to being a parent. That stresses and strains and tensions and alienations happen, but you don't throw in the towel on the relationship just because you've hit a rough patch. Then under the heading of guidelines in this training package is skill training. How does one talk to each other when things like this happen? So in the example that I just gave, the adopting parents decided they were going to take a little bit of time just to do some deep breathing and not be in touch with birth mom. They didn't know how to discuss this with her. And ultimately they found language. The time passed. They understood they should strike when the iron is cold. They found words to use. They think adoptive mom wrote a letter that said something like, well, we certainly hit a bump in the road last December, and we figure something was going on in your life that made it hard for you to tell us that you really weren't able to come to the visit that you had asked for. And it was hard on us. We assume it was hard on you. It was certainly hard on Johnny. We hope you're feeling better now, and we're just writing now to check in and see how you're doing. And that's how they reignited the relationship. So part of this training package is to help people have the principles that would guide them in crafting the message, and to help people find the words to include in a message for navigating turbulent waters and reestablishing a relationship when there's some kind of break in the action. And the guidelines include things like, do share your needs with the other party. So for example, in the example that I'm using, the adopting parents might say, we do need you in our lives. We do want you to be in Johnny's life. We just want to be able to do this in a way that works better for you. So we need you to tell us what's going to make it easier for you to have contact with us. So in a way, it's teaching people some communication skills and some problem-solving skills, and helping people find the right language to use. And of course, families at the front end of adoption need to understand that sometimes it'll be hard to figure this stuff out on their own. And of course, the system fails in this regard. I don't know what it's like in Massachusetts, but certainly where I live in Rhode Island, there's not a large cadre of adoption competent clinicians with specific knowledge on how to help people manage open adoption relationships. And in fact, in one of the families in my research sample, they live in northern New England. Their teenage daughter was feeling very depressed and a very tumultuous time in her life, and she went to see a clinical psychologist that she liked very much and that the adopting parents liked very much. But in the course of the work, it came out that one of the things that upset the teenager was that when she emailed and Facebooked her birth mom and birth dad, they didn't respond. And this just was terrible for her. She's constantly checking to see if there'd been a response, and weeks and months would go by. And so the clinical psychologist suggested to the adopting parents and the adolescent that they sever the relationship with the birth parents because this was so upsetting to the kid. It's an example of a clinician who may not be adoption informed. In fact, in response to the therapist's suggestion, the adopting parents contacted the birth parents and explained, look, your daughter's having a really rough time, blah, blah, blah is going on, and she really, really needs you to check your email and your Facebook once a day. And if there's a message from her, Could you please just send a 1 or 2 word response so she knows that you know she's here? And the birth parent's response was, oh my gosh, we're so glad you told us. Of course we'll do that. And that fixed the problem. But anyway, that's an example of the sort of thing that parents who have some education and training in open adoption might be better equipped to do. They have the sense of self or the sense of confidence in their own skills to go against the advice of a trained clinician who's well liked by the family, but not necessarily informed about these kinds of issues. Susan talked a few moments ago about how important it is that nobody be coerced. It's important that professionals not coerce, and it's important that first parents and adoptive parents not coerce each other or the child. Do not deceive is a very difficult guideline. In my research, there are adoptive parents who deceive birth parents and vice versa, and that gets in the way of effective open adoptions. And helping people learn how to say the truth in diplomatic words is important, and that's one of the goals of this training package. And at the end of the training package, there's a large number of scenarios of situations identified in my research with adoptive families where things were going awry. So there are slides presenting the difficult scenario, and then there's a companion slide suggesting words that people could use in order to help families manage the difficult scenario. And of course, the training includes guidance for people in how to establish boundaries and expectations that are unambiguous. Then there are other guidelines for effective open adoption in the training package. For example, it's more comfortable to plan for as much contact as people are comfortable with now, rather than planning for tons of contact and then having to shove the door a little bit closed. It makes more sense to keep the door a little bit open in the beginning, and then as the research shows, people become more and more comfortable over time as nothing bad happens, and then it's easier to nudge the door more and more open. Another guideline would be not to slam the door shut at any point in time, but always leave it slightly ajar. You can always recalibrate the contact down when things are getting difficult, as in the example that I used before, where the family had very little contact after the incident with the 13 hours in the airport. They took some time out. So that's an example of not cutting off contact, but keeping the door slightly ajar. Keeping the trail warm. When it's common for, well, at least in my research sample, I don't know in other studies. In my research sample, when contact starts to cut back, generally it's because the biological parents are not responding to the adoptive parents' overtures. And in my sample, adoptive parents have handled that differently. Some have taken the stance, well, they don't want contact right now, so that's that. Others have said, you know what, I'm going to just keep sending that birthday card and that Mother's Day card and that December holiday card anyway, even though there's no response, just because I want to know that the cards got delivered, they're not returned undeliverable. I'm keeping the trail warm for my child, so my child never has to have a fresh, raw search, even though the birth family has fallen out of contact. Only make promises you can keep. That's attached to do not coerce. If we're not coercing and arm twisting, then nobody's going to be pressured into agreeing to something that they don't really agree to. Remain committed to the relationship, go to professionals for guidance, continue to educate yourself, really work at viewing the other non-judgmentally. A lot of my clinical work in open adoptions is around this. We all have our own personal sources of countertransference. It's hard for me when adoptive parents are saying things like, in scornful, angry language, well, the birth mother's a prostitute and she's a drug addict and she's in and out of prison and she's a bad influence, and they're understandably angry. And sometimes with success, sometimes not so much with success, I try to offer different language for describing the same thing. Like, it sounds like your daughter's birth mom is experiencing some of the issues that led her to make the adoption plan. So you have a choice. You can be angry at her for that, which is understandable, or you can understand it as part of her struggle. And she does have a disease. I don't think there are too many people who wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to spend my life as a drug addict. That's what I want for myself. Any more than somebody wakes up and says, I think I'm going to choose to have cancer. That's how I want to live my life. So there's work that we can do to help people use non-judgmental language even when they're feeling pretty angry at somebody about their behavior. And also, in this training package, we try to help birth parents develop the language and the skills for explicitly giving the adopting family their permission to be the child's parents. And in successful open adoptions, birth parents might, from time to time, reignite that message, both to the child and to the adopting parents. Okay, the non-judgmental language extends to the way we talk with the kids as well. That's on the part of both the birth parents and the adoptive parents. As Susan said a moment ago, it's really important that the child know that the child has control over when and whether to have contact. In some of the open adoptions, kids poop out on the contact for a while when they're upset or angry or just want to pretend that they're not adopted, and that's okay. It doesn't mean the child is not going to do it ever again. In those instances, it can make sense for the adults to maintain contact with each other, even though the child's not participating during that phase. And it's also very important for all the adults to remember that a child may misbehave before, during, and after visits, but that does not necessarily signify that visits should stop. It might signify that visits should stop, but if none of the adults is engaging in behavior that would be upsetting to a child, it may be that this is just part of the child's process of working through their feelings. So it's important for people to understand that. And now, the how to cope with challenging situation slides, and we're pretty much right on schedule. That's pretty good.
At the end, we have 15 scenarios of challenging situations, and we have the participants role play, different ways of dealing with these situations. And I just put a couple of them in here. This is the first one. The birth parent gives birth to a younger sibling and chooses to parent that child. And the young adopted child is struggling with this. And this is just one scenario. We could role play it and I'll come up with a different suggestion, but in this beautiful solution, Deborah, I think, wrote this. The birth parent might say to the child, I wasn't able to take care of a baby when you were born. Every child needs a forever family. That's why I ask your parents to adopt you. They are your forever mom and dad, and I'm your forever birth mother. We all love you very much. Obviously, this is one statement, but by helping both birth parents and adoptive parents think about we try to apply these principles that we've already talked about to coming up with a solution in this situation and just helping them think about what some of the different possibilities are. This is a second challenging situation where the adoptive parent tries to stop the contact. It's interesting. I think in Ruth's research, they found that when you ask adoptive parents where contact had stopped, who's made that decision, they're more likely to say the birth parent, and the birth parent's more likely to say the adoptive parent. So the perceptions differ, but it's important to help them recognize and try to empathize with the need or not necessarily perceive negative motives in the other person that are not there, to check out what the need is that's leading to this statement. In this situation, the adoptive parent's son is in preschool and says, we don't think it's a good idea for us to continue to visit or exchange emails now. And this is thinking of different ways the birth parent could respond. Do any of you want to volunteer solutions? If you were a birth parent, what might be helpful to say? great. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was interesting, several social workers, when we did this survey, responded that they had had several cases where the adoptive family and the birth mom had been visiting once or twice a year for several years, but the adoptive parents had never told the child that this was the birth mother. You know, this was just this friendly woman that came for visits. And at the point the child was 5 or 6 and asking questions where they had to say who this person was, they became more resistant, you know, to the visiting. And I don't know if that is underneath the situation, but I was kind of surprised at that you could go that many years into an open adoption relationship and not talk with a child about who the birth mother is. But evidently, communicative openness is not occurring here.
And so in response, I have two things, one in response to this and one in response to what you were saying. In response to this, what I would suggest is saying something like, wow, yeah, life is changing, and I know you're going to be super busy with him now being in preschool. Maybe Skyping or something else might fit into your schedule better, just to give, you know, that understanding, starting off with that understanding, and then offering alternative ways of contact. But then to what you were saying, at my agency, we actually include in the open adoption communication agreement a piece, if there's to be visits, a piece about if either party moves out of state, they agree to facilitate at least one visit a year. And if a location can't be agreed upon, then the visit will happen in the Puget Sound area because that's where the adoption took place, and that each party will be responsible for their own travel arrangements and things like that, so that there's that fallback net in case that does happen, because it happens a lot. People move, life happens, so that it's not all of a sudden, oh my God, they're moving and I'm never gonna see this child again, sort of thing.
So you help them anticipate what if someone moves, which is helpful. This was the response that we came up with. I respect your right to make decisions, but basically I'd like to talk with you about ways we can still stay connected. And I'm wondering if I've said or done something that's made you uncomfortable, basically trying to get honest communication going. Okay, the last one I included here was the birth parent doesn't respond to the child's letters, calls, Facebook messages, and the child says, why won't she answer me? Much like what Deborah just talked about.
So if you were the adoptive parent in this situation, what might you say to the child?
Or the birth parent.
Well, this is where the birth parent isn't responding to the child, so it would be the adoptive parent having to talk with the child about it in a way that follows the principles and guidelines that we just quickly reviewed. Any ideas? Here you go.
Susan?
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, that's a really little child, so in that picture. But my child is 20, and she's got a lot of issues, and she's emailing her birth mom, and her birth mom's not emailing her back. I think she's pulling away because she has some feelings about the problems my child has. And so she says, you know, I keep emailing Linda, and she won't email me back. And what I say to her is, well, what do you think's going on with Linda? You know, what do you think is going on? And so it just opens up a conversation about it. And she said, well, maybe she's, maybe she's worried about me and doesn't know how to respond. I mean, she seems to come up with an authentic way to think about it. So, I don't know, I heard you say earlier, though, that, you know, a parent, it was recommended that a parent like call her and say, can you just do this, you know? So I'm thinking, should I be doing that? I mean, my daughter's 20, it's her relationship. I don't know, you know? I mean, I'm happy to tell anybody what to do, but I want it to be, you know, a good outcome.
That's a really great question, because what I have found in my research, having started with following adoptive families when they had an infant, now I feel like Phil Donahue walking around. But now the adoptive families have young adults, and what I'm seeing is that now that the kids are in charge, they're not kids, right? They're young adults. They're in charge of their own relationships with the biological families, and it's a whole different ball of wax now, right? And for the most part, the adoptive parents in my sample have just instinctively granted their adult children free rein. It's the adoptive parents no longer mediate the relationship at all. And yet in one instance, actually recently, an adoptive mother of a 24-year-old called me, somebody from my research sample, to describe this situation. The 24-year-old adoptee had gone on vacation with the adopting family. It was a family vacation. The birth mother sent a very angry email to the adopting parents saying, how dare you? She was supposed to go on vacation with me. So the adopting parents were like, ooh, what do we do? And we worked out a script that applied the principles in this training package. And so the adopting parents together crafted an email response which went something like, Dear Mary, we're so glad you're letting us know that you're upset, because we really value our open and honest communication with you. So thank you for reaching out to us to share your feelings. We want to assure you that we did not in any way influence whatever the kid's name was, you know, Anne, when Anne decided where she was going to spend her vacation. In fact, we didn't even know that she had planned a vacation with you. So we're so sorry that this thing has evolved in such a way that you feel squeezed out. We just want to remind you that for 24 years we've been very committed to having the relationship that we have with you, and that as Mary, or Anne, whatever her name was, goes through adulthood, we want to continue for us all to be one big extended family. So thank you for sharing your feelings with us, and we hope that in the future when you're concerned about something, you'll let us know. That happened in January, and it's now April, and other than a quick email that the birth mother sent back saying, thank you very much, I feel better now, there hasn't been any further contact between the two sets of parents. So my impression is things are quiet now between the two sets of parents, and maybe not so quiet between the adoptee and her birth mom. And what that scenario illustrates for me is something that surprises me, but I'm seeing it across my research sample, that even though these are open adoptions, now that the kids are grown-ups and in charge of their own relationships, some of the boundary challenges and relationship negotiation things that we've seen when closed adoptions open up seem to be issues even in open adoptions, which was something I hadn't anticipated.
Okay, you can go ahead and read the model response. But we have 15 scenarios in this curriculum, and then there's an additional group of scenarios that you could use later that we decided were too scary. Most of them are from Deborah's research. Too scary for the beginning training, but if you have an ongoing support group or something for families, or if you just want to think about them yourself, there were other challenging situations to think about. What about those of you in here who do training around openness? What kinds of situations do you most often run into?
What are some of the challenging situations that pop up in the open adoptions that you're watching people live through? Yeah, Susan.
All the parents that we work with have open adoption agreements, and what becomes a challenge is when they deter from those agreements and start independently calling and having all kinds of contact, and then at some point somebody gets their knickers in a knot and then they want to just stop. And I'm so glad we have the enforceable agreement, although I don't have to say it's an enforceable agreement. I just say, I'm going to make sure you have a copy of your agreement, and let's talk about how we can pull this back, and let's create some safety and security for all of you, so that, and I know you want to do the best thing for your child. I mean, I just, you have to really hit the parent where, somebody was saying yesterday, every parent wants to be a good parent, and just talk about, I know you want to be such a good parent, and I know you want to have a really open, healthy adoption, and let's just take a step back and make that happen. So, but that is the biggest issue, is that when they go outside and set all kinds of expectations, and then they're surprised. It's, I think it's best illustrated by an adoptive parent who said, the birth parent called me. And I'm like, well, how do you think that happened? And she said, well, I gave her my phone number. And it's like, well, in my world, if I give someone my phone number, I expect them to call me. And so I think again, there's just no blueprint for these things. And so that's where people tend to get in trouble, is they go outside what they think they've committed to structurally and communicatively, and don't know what to do. So
that was a good example. Yeah, you wanted to say something? Yeah. I'll talk while I'm walking over there if I can remember what it was I was going to say now that I distracted myself from my thought. You've got a situation, okay.
Another situation I'm encountered, I'm a birth mother, and my daughter has a sister who is also adopted, and her sister has no contact with her birth mother. So while I'm supposed to have a semi-open adoption, when my daughter was 5, I was asked to stop contacting them because it was causing conflict between the two girls. And so I was wondering if you, if you've encountered anything where one child has contact and the other doesn't, and what works best in those situations.
Yeah, that's a very painful situation, and actually we don't have a specific guideline, but we should add it. One guideline that I live by is you never deprive one child of contact that makes sense for that one child because somebody else in the family doesn't have that much contact. And that inequality, imbalance is so common. There's hardly a family that I know that doesn't have some imbalance. And I think that parents need training up front in how to anticipate what is a very anticipatable. And the families that I'm involved with tend to ask the more involved birth mother to function kind of as birth parent to the child who doesn't have as much contact. And in no instance, at least in my limited experience, has a birth parent, birth mother, birth father said, no, I'm going to ignore Susan because Johnny is the one that I'm related to. They're happy to, so yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you. Yeah, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just wanted to address that as well. I'm a social worker, and we placed a sibling group of 3 in a family where they had, and these children were 3, 5, and 9 when we placed them, and they have an adopted child who they adopted at birth. And these 3 children have an open adoption with their birth parents and their brother. And it stirred up all kinds of feelings for the child who didn't have contact. But in this case, I think the family is just kind of going with it and trying to help the older child figure out, what does she need right now? She's now 12. This is kind of a normal age for her to be thinking about her own birth parents. It came a little bit quicker than they had anticipated, but they are working with it. So it just feels like that can be worked out.
Yes, it can be worked out. Oh, you wanted to? I'm making my way over there, but here, go ahead.
We have a situation, it's a very new adoption. The child's only 13 months old, but the adoptive parents made an agreement for 4 visits a year, and they're very happy to honor that. But the visits are sort of getting hijacked. They made an agreement with the birth parents, but the birth parents' parents are coming to the visits and swooping in, handling the baby, and the birth parents are sort of taking off. They feel so uncomfortable and not empowered enough to say, we want to visit with him. They don't feel comfortable speaking back to their parents. So we're really trying to help them set some limits and say there can be a time for the grandparents, but the agreement was that the parents have the visit. And we have a picnic every year. That might be a great place to have the whole entire family, but trying to maintain the parents' rights to, the adoptive parents' rights to set limits on the birth parents' rights to have the visit that they had the agreement about.
That's a great example of how hard it can be for people to find their voice and state their needs. They want to be nice, they don't want to alienate anybody, and so they feel silenced by their own feelings. And then they're upset with the other person who has failed to read their mind.
That happens in marriage a lot.
So in our open adoption training at our agency, we have a family who's adopted from us before come in and talk to them. And I always try to get someone who has either a biological child and then adopted, or who has two adopted children with different birth parents, just so that we can have them address the issue of, different levels of openness. And then, I mean, even in my own situation, my son's brother doesn't have contact with his birth parents, but, when St. Patrick's Day rolls around, I send 2 cards. I don't just send one. When birthdays roll around, Christmas, all those things. So, like what you're saying, like, I can't remember who said, maybe it was you who said, that, if the other person doesn't have as much contact, then, the one that does have contact can step up and kind of be that surrogate person. I think at age 7, Brian's just kind of getting it that I'm not his birth mom, but, when I come to visit, I don't ignore him. I hang out with him as well. So I think that's really good. And then as far as what was on the slide and the different scenarios, we have them brainstorm what their fears are. And then they hear from the family that's already adopted, and they get to ask them about some of those fears. But then after that, they break into groups and discuss, okay, what if, the things that you've put on the board, like this group talked about this one, this group talked about that one, and you've heard, you've brainstormed them, you've heard from someone who's living it, what would you do in those situations? And I think it's just really important to make sure that potential adoptive parents have to think about these things before placement.
And it is so hard, obviously, for people to think about stuff like this before placement, because before placement is like, get me baby, which is obviously why ongoing relationships with people who can provide support are necessary and sadly so hard to find. Jen, were we supposed to end at 4:15? I don't remember. Oh, okay. It's time for us to applaud, yes.